We are nearing the end of 1 Peter after a long journey, but it's been good. It's been good. We're starting chapter 5 today, but obviously before we hop in, we need to cover some context. We don't have to spend super long on it, but I think it'd be good to at least go over it a little bit. As always, I'll just start with you guys. What are some common themes that we've been talking about really throughout this whole letter?
Suffering for the sake of righteousness.
I think the testing of our faith has been a big one. The people he's writing this letter to at the time were obviously going through something very harsh and cruel to them, and Peter was asking them to do the unthinkable, to turn the other cheek to their persecutors and not revile them as they have been slandered and hunted down by these people who don't understand why they live the lives that they do. Peter's also saying that, why are you shocked by this behavior? They are of the world, not of Christ. And so, as long as you keep your faith in Him, you will be able to rejoice on the day of His revelation, so to speak. And that testing of the faith has really been a through line throughout the whole book. I know we've turned to the line about the testing of the faith being more precious than gold, because it ties to something more spiritual. It's not a material thing that we can, grasp and have a tangible amount of. And it leads to our eternal salvation in the end, if we keep our faith strong.
Yeah, it's not the end-all be-all description of faith, but at least in this letter, the author, of course Peter, but the author seems to think of or describe faith as the kind of faith where someone is able to do those things. So they're able to not retaliate, they're able to ultimately trust in the fact that there is a God who is going to bring justice, and in that they're able to actually live a holy lifestyle despite those around them. And ultimately that is kind of how he's emphasizing faith in this letter, because someone who has faith that in the end God is going to bring justice to all the wrongs in the world, they don't feel the need to take vengeance in their own hands, right? That's kind of been the underlying thing. And really throughout, another big thing has been really showing your faith through your actions, through your good conduct. And that is both shown through the testing of your faith, but also it is it's a testament really to those around you, to whomever is persecuting you, but also to whom is persecuting them, but also to those who are watching, right? Whether these are other non-believing Jews that are persecuting potentially Christian Jews, that is the audience, or whether it's Gentiles around them.
This is more of like a broader thing, but I know we also talked about how most of the letters written to the early Christian church were either A, like for example Corinthians, would be you're doing it wrong, you guys need to back up, read your Bibles or tours a little more, and repent. Or it's stuff like this where it's like, you guys are relatively doing pretty good, here are some things you can work on, and you need to stay strong and keep the faith.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's another point I wanted to bring up, but I can't think of it right now.
Mm-hmm. That's okay.
He's also calling for a stronger sense of unity within the believers of the church, because when everyone else is against them, they only have each other.
Yeah, that's true.
And we also discussed that this would be primarily, we think this was primarily written to Jewish Christians,
Right.
just because of the way it's directly addressing them, and it's like, oh, the Gentiles are watching. You make sure you have good conduct for them.
Yeah, all the textual evidence does point to that. And we talked about how in some places for sure that can have some pretty big implications on how you interpret for certain verses. Like for example, when he like where he quotes Hosea and other parts where your interpretation might change based on how you interpret who the audience is. What else? Some other, it doesn't have to be necessarily super broad things, but other important things we've been talking about.
One thing that Nick said is he said that that Peter's asking them to do the unthinkable, and I don't think we really used that language so far, but that's a good description of what he's asking them to do, because really the whole letter is a big paradigm shift. Like this kind of is what Joseph was talking about too. Like, different letters. Some letters are literally just like letters of reproof, where like he's just like you read Galatians, and Galatians opens up, and Paul's just like, y'all are idiots. Like he's just like getting on to them. But then there's some letters where it's like this, where in general he's not getting on to them. He's just warning them, and it's almost like they've already faced a little bit of pushback, but he expects it's going to get worse. And so he's giving them like a worldview that's almost like a whole paradigm shift that will help them endure what is coming. And it's like a lot of times whenever we think of application, like whenever it comes to Bible study, we always think, what are 5 different things that I can do today to be a better Christian? But that's not really how Peter is going about it. And I really argue that's not how the Bible goes about it. I think that what Peter's going for is he's trying to change the worldview, right? It's not simply like, okay, I need to be nice to people who are mean to me. It's like, it goes deeper than that. You have to change your worldview so that you don't even feel the temptation to lash out in vengeance, right? Like that's what's being argued here, right? It's not simply suppressing your thirst for justice. It's recognizing that God will provide justice, right? And that also will involve, like, it changes your view of suffering, right? We naturally view suffering as an inherently evil thing because, we naturally crave comfort and peace, and we like to, be at ease in this world. Whereas he's like, no, change your worldview, right? You are getting to share in Christ's sufferings, right? You are allowing your faith to be tested, right? So it's like, you're not simply acting like suffering is a good thing. Instead, you're viewing it from a different perspective that allows you to recognize that there's a silver lining to it. And that if God has allowed you to suffer, maybe it's because you do need this. And I don't know, I just like that he really is asking them to do the unthinkable because he's forcing them to think differently, right? Like from a world perspective, everything he says here does not make sense. But that's because from a worldly perspective, it's just a totally different worldview. And so he says, yes, you're going to do the unthinkable because you're going to start thinking like a different person. And really, I'd say that's probably how almost every letter of the New Testament is, because I don't think there's any of the authors who are like, I just want you to just do stuff differently because I say so. All of them flow from a logic of the gospel. It's like, okay, if Jesus is like, if this is who God is, and this is what he did for us, then this is how we should live. Right, so it all starts with a worldview, and I think that just naturally breeds better application than, like if you can get people to think differently, they're naturally going to apply things better. Whereas if you just tell people what to do, they might apply it for like a week and then forget. Right? I mean, kind of like a New Year's resolution. Right? You can create a list and say, I'm going to do these 3 things. Okay, you'll do that for like a week. Like, I'm going to go to the gym. All right, cool. But if you start viewing like fitness as like this like key aspect to who you are, well, that's going to work a little bit better than like, New Year's resolution, right? Same thing with this. And so, I don't know, I just like that phrase, do the unthinkable. Because, I mean, who would generally think, rejoice when you face trials? Like, that is the opposite of what you typically think, so.
Right, well, whenever all you have to look forward to is this world, I mean, it isn't kind of inherently a bad thing. Right?
Yeah.
Because it's just preventing you from doing what you want to do in this life.
Well, and if you do change your gears, being in a different perspective, then like a lot of times, like an and again, we're not really persecuted, so I guess this isn't like 100% applicable. But it's just like whenever something is delayed or pushed back, you have to look at it and you have to realize, you have to be like, okay, is it really that big of a deal? And if someone's like really doing me wrong at the end of the day or trying to like do me wrong, just God's gonna take care of it at the end of the day. So.
This really is not relevant to like Peter, but it ties into what you're talking about there.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's like a direct correlation.
Yeah, but sorry, what you said there, I don't even know exactly what it was that you said, but it reminded me of something that I was sharing with the students. And like I said, this is not going to tie into Peter, so after I say this, you don't even have to respond. You can just go straight into the actual text. But I was talking with my students today, and I think it was because I think you said something about like, you know, we have struggles and like we get anxious or stressed. I don't remember exactly what you said.
Yeah.
But I gave a quiz today with my students, and they were like stressing out severely. And I was like, guys, first off, tell me you've never taken one of my quizzes without telling me you've never taken one of my quizzes, because like my quizzes are easy, right? They're not hard at all. Like the average for my quizzes today was like 105, right? It was not hard. But some of the kids came in and they were stressing out, and I was like, guys, y'all just need to like be less anxious. Like you need to stop. And eventually they took the quiz and they were fine. But as I was teaching later in the day, we were talking about the Zealots, like the Jewish group who led the revolt against Rome. And like I said, this is not relevant at all, so don't expect that this is going to tie in any way whatsoever. It was just like a tangent that I had to mention because I thought it was funny. And we were talking about the Zealots and like how they led a revolt against the Romans, and ultimately they failed. And how, you know, as a result, Israel ceased to be a nation for 2,000 years. And we were just like talking about in general, like, I don't know, like whenever I was talking about the Zealots, you could tell like the guys were like, oh, those guys sound awesome. And I was like, yeah, but if you think about it, they're kind of like the biggest failures in the world. Like they're pretty cool because they're like one of the first like assassin groups in like human history. Like they had like this like secret organization. Like that's pretty cool. But like as a direct result of their actions, like the kingdom of God ceased to be a nation for 2,000 years. And so like I was telling them, so if you ever get stressed out about like failing a quiz or exam or something, just remind yourself, at least I'm not a zealot. Like, you know, like if you fail an exam, you know what? Okay, I can take another exam later. But like at least your actions didn't result in like the nation you love the most being destroyed for 2,000 years. And I don't know, I just realized like that's like a nice little that's a way of like alleviating stress. You know, whenever you're like severely stressed about something, just be like, well, at least I'm not a zealot. So, yeah. Like I said, has nothing to do with 1 Peter, but he mentioned something about stress, and maybe I'm just so tired right now that I didn't have a filter. But now you know that story.
I chose to do engineering. I guess I'm asking to be stressed 90% of the time. So.
Well, at least you're not a zealot, though.
I think we've all been stressed and gone through anxiety as humans because we naturally do not like pain and suffering. So if we ever go through stuff like that, we just need to tell ourselves God is doing this for a reason, and we should just let him do what he wants to do and learn from it.
Yeah, stress is just so goofy, though.
It is.
Like I was talking to my students today, and like they hate it because I always do this with people when they stress. I just say like, stop it, and they're like, it's not that easy. I'm like, it really is though. Like, I mean, I don't apparently it's not that easy for most people, but like, just stop it. All right, anyways, we should probably get 1 Peter before I get like canceled for saying that like stress is easy to whatever. I'm gonna stop talking now.
All good. Okay. I'll go ahead and read the last few verses of chapter 4, and then that'll flow into chapter 5. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you are sharing the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer, or thief, or evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be put to shame, but is to glorify God in this name. For it is time for judgment to begin with the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God must entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing good.
Oh, you have to click off the little thingy. And then you have to click on the screen. There we go.
Therefore, I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, overseeing not under compulsion, but willingly, according to God, and not for dishonest gain, but with eagerness. Nor yet as lording it over those allotted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. You younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders, and all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Alrighty. Any thoughts, questions, concerns, fun facts?
It sort of reads like
Sorry.
Parts of chapter 3 where he was addressing specific groups of people within the Jewish Christians and giving them specific orders that related to them, because it really is like the whole letter is a groundwork for how they are to live their lives from this point forward. And he's just trying to remind them of, if you hold this position, if you belong to this group, this is what you need to do.
Here I feel like in chapter 5 he's mostly going to be addressing the elders. Because in verses 1 and 2 it just makes it very clear. He says, therefore I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow partaker, as a fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ. So he identifies himself as an elder. He's like, hey, I can relate to what you guys are going through and what you have to do. And then he calls them the shepherds. Shepherd the flock of God among you, overseeing, not under compulsion, but willingly according to God, and not for dishonest gain, but for eagerness. So, that just tells me this whole chapter is going to be like, he's going to be talking to elders, giving them instruction.
So not going back to chapter 3, but with that in mind, what do all of these relationships have in common, if that makes sense what I'm asking? So what, at least two that I can think of, what two main relationships did he address in chapter 3 specifically?
Wives and husbands.
Wives and husbands, and there was
Slave
slave and master, and I guess there was also a more general one too, but it wasn't like two, it was just him saying be subject to all authority. And then with this in mind, what's kind of like one of the common denominators through all of these?
There's a power dynamic between the two groups that he's addressing. There's one in an authoritative position and another who is usually subject to that authority.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that, but I think there's a reason for that. But yeah, like you and also David was saying, they seem to all be revolving around authority dynamics. So like you said, either being in authority or being under authority, basically, and how we're supposed to relate to one another in that sense.
Well, it makes sense why he would begin to talk about this here, because if we're supposed to submit to the cruel authorities of the world, then there's this extra responsibility on the authorities of the church to make sure that they're not being like the world. Like, they need to set an example of good leadership so that people can learn how to submit to leadership in a positive way, so that then they can be prepared to submit to leadership whenever the leadership isn't as good.
Yeah,
If that makes sense.
that's true. It's helping them actually, and I think even earlier in the letter, we were kind of talking about how there's the necessity for the church unity to actually carry out these commands.
Yeah.
I just realized how long we've been going through 1 Peter. That is wild. Because when we were doing, that was chapter 3 that it talked about the authorities?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. Because remember, I got like all convicted and I went and apologized to my students. That was at the end of last school year. An entire summer has gone by and we're only in chapter 5. That is crazy.
Uh-oh.
Like, I'm already 2 weeks into a new school. That is, wow.
That's true. I didn't
That
know
is
that.
crazy. Because I felt super convicted that literally the next day I went to school and like, we still had a few weeks after that too.
Mhm.
That is wild.
Yeah, that was-
Sorry. Like, it just clicked in my head. I was like, there's no way. That is, wow.
It was even further than that because they started talking about authority in chapter 2.
Yeah,
So yeah.
it's wild. Alright, sorry. All my comments are just going to be like tangents today. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Start. Like, what was the first day of study?
Oh, I can look that up later, but
Yeah.
sorry. See, this is why I should have made comments like that.
Okay. Back
So-
back to the text.
So I don't necessarily have like a specific answer in mind to this, but just to be thinking, why do you think it is that he talks so much about this authority dynamic? Like, he talked about it earlier, and now he's talking about it. Like, what's the significance of really all of it? Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
Yeah.
I think there's a few aspects to it. One of them is that naturally humans don't like submitting to authority. And so it doesn't matter how many times you tell somebody, hey, God wants you to do this, we're still not going to listen. And so it's like he has to repeat it over and over again. I think another aspect is, once again, just their context. There'd be a natural temptation to rebel against authority. Because you could say, oh, well, this, the authority above us, they're not godly, right? It's one thing if they're godly leaders, and Peter's addressing both of those, right? He's saying, no, it's your job to submit no matter what. However, for those of y'all who are in charge, well, make sure that you're not abusing that, right? All because they have to listen doesn't mean that you have the right to abuse them and like there are some pastors who they don't listen to this. Like they use their authority to like force the church to do stuff. That's not a godly example either. And I would say that, sorry, this is kind of going beyond this, but this is why I always get frustrated by, even like when parents will say, I'm the parent, you're the kid, you need to listen. I don't really like that mentality. I mean, there's probably some times where it's justified, but in general, it seems to go against the principles governing these views of authority in Scripture. Because in general, the warnings to leaders are always, don't abuse your authority. Right? It's not your job to force people to listen. With a parent, it might be slightly different because you're responsible for disciplining your child. But your job is to make sure you're not abusing that authority. Right? And so I think that that's why he's lingering on this so much, because there's like a general context that we don't like authority, but then also in their specific context, they wouldn't have liked it, especially then.
Yeah, that's true.
I agree with what David said, that pretty much if these Christians view themselves as godly and the authorities as ungodly, that gives them a right to overthrow the authorities. But I also think another angle is reputation, that teaching a group of Christians, like paying your taxes or something, if they rebel against the authority, it can make all of Christianity look bad if that group is disobedient and disruptive to the authority. Like, it just stains the image of the group.
Right, it only takes one bad example to ruin 100 good ones.
People do remember negativity.
Yeah, people who are it's easier to remember negativity over positive events or impacts.
That's true. And kind of retouching on what you said a second ago, David, it's also just the simple truth of, if you can't be willing to submit to the authorities in your church body, then how do you expect to actually possibly submit to the authorities above you in the world? I mean, that's just practical. And I think there's also, I guess we did probably have touched on it before, but also just the simple fact that is what Christ did too. And so if we call, God Father, and if we call Christ Lord, part of that is submitting to the authorities on earth. Like, we can't really say that God is our Father and that Christ is Lord, but be unwilling to submit to those in authority above us, whether it's, worldly authorities, or whether it's wife and husband, slave master, or shepherd and flock. And likewise, if you're the one in authority. I think really all the other examples of authority were where it, like, his audience was the ones under the authority, whereas this is the only example where the person being addressed was the one in authority. So in the other ones, we're called to submit because we can't really control how those disobedient husbands or cruel masters or world authorities, we can't really control what they do. And we can't even really uphold them to Christian morals and values because they're not Christian. Or in their case, same thing, but we can control how we respond, right? And we've been talking throughout this letter about how really our greatest testimony is the way that we conduct ourselves. And so here, like, for those who are in the church, who are in authority, they're not to abuse their authority because that has been given to them by God. In the same way that Christ did not abuse his authority as Lord, and also when he was on earth. Like we read in Philippians, he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself. So if we're to actually walk in obedience to Christ, that it goes both ways because it just naturally flows from the gospel, really. What else do y'all think? I guess we haven't really gone through verse by verse yet,
No.
so
Yeah.
let's go ahead and do that. So here in verse 1. Therefore I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. So we'll stop there. What's he saying there? I guess he hasn't said much yet, but
I guess really he's just addressing the elders and identifying himself as an elder in the Christian community himself. And I mean, that's basically it. And he says he's a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed, which basically means I'm a Christian and I'm not like taking this seriously.
It's waiting for God's return.
because technically in verse 1 he could just say, therefore I exhort the elders among you, and then go to verse 2. So most of verse 1 is actually like almost like a parenthetical that he's just choosing to include.
Yeah, one thing that I think that he's doing there is that he could just say, I exhort you as an apostle. Right? He could just kind of pull the apostle card and like throw it down there. But instead he puts himself on their level. Like he still shows how he is distinct because he points out, I'm a witness of the sufferings of Christ. So he does identify himself as an eyewitness. But he doesn't pull the apostle card. Instead, basically, it seems like what he's doing is he's putting himself on their level by saying, the command I'm giving you, I'm also holding myself to. Right? So it's not like, because like if he said, as an apostle, that would be him using his authority to command them to not abuse their authority. Right? And you could almost consider that an abuse of authority. It wouldn't be, but you can almost view it that way. You know what I mean? Like if he's like, hey, since I'm the one in charge of you, you need to listen and make sure you don't abuse your authority. But instead he says, no. I'm your fellow elder. Right? This is how we need to conduct ourselves. Right? And I'd say that's kind of cool. So it's there's other ways he could have referred to himself, but instead he chooses to put himself on their level, which reflects somebody who does understand Christ. Because, Christ said, the leader, like the greatest amongst you, must be servant of all. And that's kind of what Peter is presenting himself as here. Right? He is technically the greatest amongst them, but he puts himself on their level. And I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah. I agree with that. What else there? So, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ. Why would he mention that? Witness of the sufferings of Christ.
Is that a claim of authority for him? Does that make him important?
More like a claim of credibility, that his teachings would, follow in the word of Christ, and that this is what, he was exhorting onto his disciples, which Peter was one of them. So.
Yeah, I think it's like a two-sided thing. On one hand, kind of what y'all were talking about, like, he is like giving himself credibility. Because he's saying, guys, I'm not just some random dude off the side of the road acting like I know what Christ would want. He's like, no, I witnessed the sufferings of Christ. I was there. So on one hand, he's giving himself credibility, but he's also citing the fact that he himself physically beheld the fact that Christ did set that example for them. Because throughout the letter, he's been pointing out that Christ is their example for how they should submit to authority. Christ is their example of how they should suffer, all those things. And this is not like for us, whenever we talk about this, we are calling back to what the apostles reported, right? And so, heck, for all we know, I mean, obviously we have reason to believe what the scripture says, but let's say hypothetically, the apostles were wrong. Well, for us, we're just placing our faith in what they said. Peter is saying, no, I was there. I know for a fact that what I'm saying is true. This is the example that Christ set for us, right? Whereas for me, all I can say is, this is, for a fact, the example that the apostles report that Christ set for us. For all we know, the real Christ, he was a, wannabe Messiah who revolted against Rome, and he was killed in the revolt, right? In which case, he was not submitting to authority. Again, that's a hypothetical. Obviously, we believe that the Gospels are accurate. I'm just saying that he's doing two things. He's giving himself credibility, but he's also showing that the whole message is credible, because he's not just some guy who's just spouting out theology. He is giving his teachings based off of his own memories of the example that Christ set. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Right? He's like, I saw what he did. That's what we need to do. That kind of makes sense.
It's not like telephone or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is true.
Another thing worth highlighting, not because it necessarily contributes to our understanding of the passage. This is just more like a church history thing worth knowing. The Greek word for elder there is the word presbyteros, which technically means elder, but it also can be translated as presbyter. So if you ever hear the term presbyter in like a church context, that's what it's referring to, right? So different people will translate it different ways, because an elder technically, it typically has in mind an older person, but it doesn't limit it to that. Elders typically just means the leaders in the church, right? Typically they were older, but technically a younger person could be one, but they'd still be called an elder, and so sometimes it's just translated as presbyter. That's whenever, like, if you think of Presbyterians, well, their church structure is, elder focused, right? Whereas like with Baptists, we're more deacon focused and stuff like that. That's just a thing worth knowing. If you're ever wondering where the word presbyter or Presbyterian comes from, it's from the word for elder. Just fun fact to bring up at parties.
True. And a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. What does he mean there? A partaker of the glory that is to be revealed.
I think waiting for Christ, anticipating his return, and preparing for it.
Yeah. Anything else?
I think he's once again just doing the same thing, where he's putting them on their level, like he's putting himself on the same level with them. He's saying that, like, it's almost like a sandwich, right? He lists one way where he's equal with them, he lists one way where he's different than them, and then he lists another way where he's equal with them, right? The two ways he's equal is that he's a fellow elder, and he's also a partaker of the glory of Christ. The thing that sets him apart is that he was a witness to Christ the first time. Right? And that's the thing that qualifies him for being an elder, and the thing that gives him confidence in the fact that they will see this glory. But I think ultimately what he's communicating with that is that, I don't know, it's kind of exciting. right? So Peter, whenever you think of Peter, you think like, oh man, this is Simon Peter himself. Like this guy is like, he's the real deal. But from his perspective, he's just waiting for the same thing all of us are waiting for, right? All of us want to see Jesus come back. And he says, guys, me too, right? He says, I saw him suffer, and I am ready to see his glory, right? That it reminds me of whenever we talk about Revelation, a lot of times I've told y'all how I love to just view it as like Jesus, the Apostle John reuniting with his friend. That's probably how all the apostles felt, right? They saw Christ, and they recognized that they saw Christ in a very limited scope, right? They saw this man who came and suffered, but they know that he is so much more, and they just can't even wait to see that glory. And so, if anything, he probably longs for that glory to be revealed more than the people he's writing to, because he actually walked with Christ, talked with Christ. He knew him face to face. And so, if anything, he just longs for it more. But I just think it's cool. He's like, guys, I'm just an elder alongside you. I saw Christ suffer, and I'm just waiting for the same thing. We just want to see him come back. I don't know, I just think that's it's kind of a sweet little notion. Because whenever we think of, I don't know, we have this way of almost idolizing the heroes of the faith. That's why we call them the heroes of the faith, right? Because we're like, oh, these people were amazing, but they were just people like us, right? Like if you were to look at King David in the Old Testament, right? We know of him as a man after God's own heart. Did he view himself that way? Probably not, right? He probably just thought he was a dude just trying to serve God, right? And he failed like all of us. He failed more severely than I hope everybody in this room has failed, right? Unless anybody has some major skeletons in the closet we need to talk about. But I don't know, we have this way, we read the stories and we read these big moments. But in reality, they're just people like us, right? Peter, he got together with people just like we're getting together with people, and they talked about Scripture together. And they were also praying that Christ would return. And yes, he had more authority, and he had greater credentials, but he's also just some fisherman from Galilee who got caught up in something way bigger than he ever expected. And he's just a fellow partaker of the glory to be revealed. Yes, because of the Holy Spirit and because of prophecy, I guess, he has greater insight to some of the things than maybe you or I do. But there's also a lot of stuff he just doesn't know. And he's like, hey, I'm just ready to see it too. And we're all going to be surprised together. I don't know, I just think that's kind of sweet.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Therefore I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, overseeing not under compulsion, but willingly, according to God. We'll just stop there. What is he saying there?
Shepherd of the flock. So he's saying, he's just basically reiterating that you guys are the leaders of the church, you're in charge, other believers look up to you. Then he's also, another more important point I should mention is, again, he's drawing that master authority servant relationship again, except he's doing it differently and pointing towards the leaders instead of telling those under authority that they need to get in line.
I think the thing to highlight here is the command he's giving them to, he's asking them to shepherd the flock, which is their duty as leaders of the church. But he's asking them to not view it as something that they're doing because they have to, but that it should be something that they do because they want to. Mm-hmm. And
I think we've touched on that before, right? You should do these things because you want to. And again, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm being persecuted and suffering for the glory of God perfectly because we live in America and we're all relative, I hope, and I'm pretty sure that all of us practice our faith persecution free. But after class today, I spent a good hour and a half tutoring my classmates over a class that I took this summer and like, I mean, I did it willingly without, I mean, I joke around about them paying me money for like me helping them, but I like wasn't serious about it. Like I didn't like get upset with them or mad at them when they asked me questions that were already like clear in my head.
I think
And it's just like kind of the, I guess I'm just trying to illustrate the idea of serving others, but
right, and I think that a big aspect of what he's talking about here is that it can't just be merely external. Like the idea is that under compulsion is more of the idea of I have to, and so you're checking off the box, but it's not coming from the right heart.
Yeah. Well, I think how often we do that, right? Where we're like, I don't want to do this, but I guess it's the Christian thing to do, so I'll do it. Well, then, the reason we're doing it isn't for the glory of God. The reason we're doing it is because we want to make ourselves feel like good Christians. And that's missing the point. He's like, no. Like, once again, it's a worldview shift, right? It's not enough to simply apply it. I mean, sometimes that's how it has to start, right? I mean, like, it's not like, well, my heart's not in the right place, so I guess I'm not going to do it. Well, no, just still do it. But ultimately, the goal is to get there. I don't know. I might have cut you off.
Yeah.
I don't know if you were still talking.
If
No, I
you're,
think that was it.
Okay.
if you're acting willingly instead of being compelled to do something, then you're acting in accordance to how God wants you to.
Yeah.
I find it interesting how we chose overseeing not under I guess that word does kind of fit, but if I was writing the letter, I wouldn't have chosen the word compulsion.
Yeah. I'll look up what that word is and then we can a second.
Forced to do something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess that's one way to word it, but I wouldn't say that. I would have said like not overseeing, not unwilling, but not like.
Well,
I
they're all
guess
like they're all like somewhat related,
Yeah.
like just out of pure obligation, whether it's like whether it means that you're being like, because I'm assuming that you are saying that like as opposed to being like forced, you're saying like just like unwilling.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all I would say somewhat related, and ultimately the main point isn't so much about what compulsion is, but more so about what willingly means, right? Because really it's willingly over anything else. So it's compulsion, unwilling, obligation. At least obligation in a like purely obligation sense.
Two things I was going to highlight real quick. I said it real quick. We know that I don't do that. So this one actually will be quick. Just maybe. Okay. The word witness back in verse 1, I didn't even think to highlight this earlier, but the Greek word is like martyros,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like it's martyr. And obviously back then, the word martyr didn't carry the same weight it does now. Because martyr for us means a person who dies for their faith. But if you just think about how the word martyr evolved over time, it's very interesting that it shows up in that context, right? I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and martyr of the sufferings of Christ. Because the word martyr or testify, or the word martyr means to testify or witness. And the reason why we call martyr, like people who died for the faith martyrs, is because the earliest church faced such persecution that if they were testifying boldly about Christ, sometimes it would lead to their death, right? So that's why we call them martyrs nowadays. But I just think it's interesting that he is martyring the suffering of Christ. And it is his martyr of the martyrdom of Christ by which he is using this moment to exhort them to also martyr for their faith and be martyred. It's just weird because obviously the word wasn't used the same way back then, but it's interesting. Another thing worth highlighting, just because we haven't talked about it yet, is the imagery of a shepherd and a flock.
Yeah.
He's talking to elders, and for those of y'all who do not know this, the word pastor literally means shepherd. I think it's from the French, right? I'm pretty sure it's the French
like
word.
French from Latin.
Yeah, French or Latin, something like that. The word pastor literally means shepherd. So whenever we're talking about a pastor of a church, it is so much more than simply a preacher, right? That's what we typically think, right? We think the pastor's main job is just to preach the sermon on Sunday. That's not what a pastor is. That is what a preacher is, right? A pastor should preach, but he should do more than that, right? A pastor's job is to take care of the flock, right? And one way they do that is by teaching. Another way they do that is visiting in the hospital, right? Being there with them, counseling them, right? Like, so a pastor is supposed to be doing so much more than simply teaching, right? And that's just important to notice. Like, I like that he says, shepherd the flock among you, because he's not simply saying, make sure you give really good sermons, right? That's not all leadership is, but that's a lot of times what we reduce it to. Why we think, okay, well, this person's a good leader as long as he gives a good sermon. Not necessarily, right? There are people who can be very good preachers, but that doesn't mean they're a good pastor. And that's just worth noting. And then also, I know I said two things, but I'm going to kind of just say that was 2A and now 2B. This language is really relevant to Peter, because if you go to the Gospel of John, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. But then after Jesus resurrects, he visits Peter. And if y'all remember in John chapter 21, this is how the conversation goes. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. To which Jesus says, tend to my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. To which he says, shepherd my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wish. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go. So, if you go back to John right there, ultimately, Jesus says, do you love me? And if so, take care of my sheep. So he says, shepherd the flock of God among you, basically. But notice what he says at the end there, right? So Peter says, I love you 3 times. Jesus says, take care of my sheep 3 times. And then after he says it the 3rd time, Jesus goes on to tell Peter how he's going to die. So from Jesus' perspective, shepherding the sheep leads to death, right? And he says, one day people are going to take you where you do not want to go. They're going to stretch your arms out, and they're going to lift you up, right? Basically, he's going to be crucified. So if you think of that in the context of this passage, it's very interesting, right? Because he's been saying, be prepared to suffer, be prepared to suffer, be prepared to suffer. And that's to everybody. And now he speaks specifically to the shepherds, right? To the pastors, to the elders. And he says, guys, shepherd the flock among you. I, your fellow elder, I bore witness to the sufferings of Christ, aka my shepherd, right? Jesus was the shepherd of the apostles, and he suffered, and he died. Jesus told Peter that he's going to suffer and die. I would argue that what Peter's saying here is that another way that they lead by example, and another way that they shepherd the flock among them, is by being willing to suffer, right? If the pastor and the elder is not willing to suffer, the people aren't going to, right? You set the example not only in the sermons you preach, not only in the love that you give, but also in the persecution you endure. And so I don't know, I just think that's if you read the Gospel of John and then read that into this, you can almost imagine that as Peter is writing these words, he's remembering that moment where Jesus is talking to him about shepherding the sheep and what that's going to cost him. And whenever Peter heard this, he had literally just borne witness to the sufferings of Christ, right? This is literally right after the resurrection. And so, I'm not saying that's what he had in mind, but you could feasibly imagine that because it's literally the same context. It is shepherd, suffering, right? And that's how you love the people, right? Because it's ultimately in the example you set. Jesus set the ultimate example for us. We are called to set the ultimate example for others.
Yeah.
I know that wasn't quick. In my head it was. I condensed it as much as I could.
I was gonna say, I think this is so he's talking about leading me, but he's also talking about, he's probably gonna talk about later, kind of like a life of service for the elders, and how they need to, lead through service, and not just completely rule over the people with, an iron fist, so to speak. I know it's already kind of touched on a little bit, but
what was I gonna say? Yeah, it's just all that, and to me also the imagery of a shepherd with a sheep is also if you just think about the imagery. I mean, the shepherd isn't sitting somewhere like a king, off in a palace getting orders. The shepherd is with the flock, actively protecting it and like going with it, or I guess leading it. But like to what David said, just again reinforcing the idea that the church leaders need to be kind of leading by example and be almost like in the fire with the people that they're shepherding. Otherwise, are they really even shepherding if they're not where the body is?
Well, that's the issue with celebrity pastors, right? You know how like nowadays, especially in a lot of churches, there's a lot of people who they've become really big names purely because they're really good at speaking, and they got big followings, but those people are not necessarily acting as pastors; they're acting as preachers. Which there's nothing wrong with being a preacher. But the issue is that you really can't tend to the needs of your people, like the shepherd. Like you can't tend to the flock unless you know the flock, right? And so that's why it's so important to be involved in a local church, right? A lot of people they'll be like, "Oh, well, I listen to podcasts." Okay, cool, that's awesome. I'm glad you listen to podcasts, but that person cannot tend to you in the same way that a local pastor can, right? Because they can get to know you. That's also why it's hard. Like big churches are also harder to pull off. Because it's a lot harder. I mean, even in like at the church we go to, First Baptist Seabrook, that church is a small church, but there's still no way for the people who lead there to know every single member of the congregation, right? It's already hard there. But in a giant church, it's even harder, right? And it's practically impossible. And that's why the only way for a mega church or a big church to thrive is that they have a really strong discipleship program with like small groups and stuff like that.
It's like in John 9:10, like my sheep know my voice and
Yes.
they listen to me.
Like back when I was at Sagemont a couple of years ago, we all, like Dave was saying, we split up into small groups, and we have a leader who was generally a bit older than us, and he would like get to know one of us, talk with one of us, know our struggles, and like be able to help us work through issues in our walk and stuff like that. So, yeah.
And Sagemont, they have a pretty good discipleship.
Yeah, they do have a good program. I had some scheduling conflicts, so I can't go there anymore. but,
Sure.
Yeah.
Also, another thing worth highlighting here, another church history thing. I'm just highlighting Greek words in case you're wondering where they come from. The word for overseeing there is episkopeo, which is the verb form of the noun episkopos, which is where we get the word episcopal, right? So have you ever heard of an Episcopalian? That's because they are run by overseers. Which is interesting because basically an overseer and an elder, biblically speaking, are the same thing. But throughout church history, people have gotten into big debates. And they're like, are presbyters and episcopos, are those the same thing? It's like, yeah. They're biblically speaking, yes. Like, whenever you look at the New Testament, the word for elder, pastor, and overseer, those are different Greek words, but they all seem to be referring to the same office. But all these different denominations we have basically just derive from people preferring one term over the other. One's like, well, I want to be an elder. I want to be an overseer. I want to be a pastor. It's like,
It's like boss, manager, supervisor.
What's that?
Like boss, manager,
Exactly.
supervisor. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to highlight that. Like, if you're wondering where Presbyterian comes from, elder. If you want to know where Episcopalian comes from, overseer. And this is worth highlighting so you know. If you want to know where Lutheran comes from, it's not from the Bible. So. That was a dude. Yeah. And obviously, as Baptists, we trace back to John the Baptist. That's a joke. That's not actually why.
It's his last name.
Yeah, exactly.
Middle name V.
Yeah. V is my middle name. That was funnier than it should have been. Just another thing about the under compulsion thing. Sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, but
No, you're good.
it's good stuff. I don't know what you're talking about whenever you said that this was just all goodbyes. I mean, this is great stuff, Sean.
Right.
We'll get to the goodbyes in a few weeks.
Right.
Yeah, shepherd the flock of God among you, overseeing not under compulsion. That's just I like that it says compulsion there, because I think that especially when it comes to ministry, there's just a lot of negatives that come with it, right? I mean, there's a lot of positives that come with it too, because you're getting to see people's lives change and stuff like that. But there is like this part where it's like it can be very discouraging, and sometimes it's almost like, okay, I'll do this because I have to, right? Like I know in my own story when it comes to like how I ended up pursuing ministry and stuff, it was not my desire, right? I literally was doing a question and answer thing with my students on Friday, and they were like, "So, Mr. Tate, how did you decide you wanted to be a Bible teacher?" And I was like, I didn't want to be a Bible teacher. I wanted to be an engineer, right? Like, going into ministry of any sorts was not anywhere on my radar. It was not what I wanted to do. Now, in many ways, I came to it under compulsion, right? It was literally like God forced my hand and was like, "You're gonna do this." I was like, "Fine, I'll do it." And I came like kicking and screaming. But now I can say that obviously there's no place I'd rather be, right? I'm not saying that my students are always the perfect, happy little sunshine and dandelion people that I'd love for them to be. But, I don't know, there's a way where you could fall into things where you almost become like resigned and like fatalistic, and you're like, the only reason I'm walking in obedience to God is because I have to, and this was the will that God foreordained for me. I was like, I don't know, like you can easily become that way because of how discouraging things can be, and you're just doing it out of some desire to be a good Christian or something. And he's saying, don't do it that way, right? If you want to be a good leader, you have to learn to love the position you're in, right? And you have to learn to love the people, right? You don't lead because you have this, like whenever people think like, oh, like this is what, like I should be a leader. Usually that's a sign you're not supposed to be a leader, right? Like if you're just like if you have this like longing to be standing in front of crowds, well, God's gonna have to work that out of you, or maybe you're not supposed to be there, right? That's the issue with some celebrity pastors. It's like their whole thing is like they're all about them. And so there should be, I think, some sort of natural reluctance to the office of like elder or something like that, because that shows that you're really following the will of God, not just like following your own ambition. But once you're there, you have to learn to love the people, right? And you shouldn't just do it under compulsion, where you're like, okay, well, I need a paycheck, so I guess I'll go preach a sermon. I guess I'll go visit hospitals. I'll go to... He's like, no. You can't just do it because you feel like you have to. You have to realize that if God has called you to it, it's a privilege. And you get to do this. Now take heed how you do it. Make sure that you don't abuse the position. And I don't know, I like that it says compulsion there, because there's a lot of nuance that comes with that. It's like, yes, you should feel like God is leading you into that position, but also at the same time, don't do it just because you have to. Like the person who is in that position must be somebody who is passionate about serving God and is doing it because they get to serve them, even if it's not what they naturally want. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so I like that it says under compulsion there. Don't do it under compulsion. Do it willingly. You are choosing. It's literally Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not my will, but yours be done. Right? Did Jesus want to go through on the cross? No, not at all. But nobody forced him to do it either. Right? Jesus chose to deny himself and pursue the will of the Father. And he counted it joy to do it. Right? That's what we have to do. Right? And I don't think that just belongs to people going into ministry. It belongs to all of us. But especially those in ministry, because they're going to be judged more strictly. Right? But every single one of us has to choose to do the same thing. Right? We shouldn't serve people under compulsion, but we should deny ourselves, choose to do the will of God, and count it joy to do it.
The words enenkostos.
What is it?
Enenkostos. It's the only occurrence of the word.
I think you said Pentecostos. I was like, oh my gosh, we got another denomination. Pentecostals.
I guess it's spelled enenkostos, but it's the G becomes like an N sound.
Oh yeah.
Enenkostos.
Okay. Yeah, so not out of necessity or being compelled. So don't do it as if you're being forced to. Ugh, I guess I'll go love people. The only reason I'm washing your nasty feet is because there's a Bible verse that tells me to do it. Don't do it that way. But do it voluntarily, willingly. I like the word voluntarily.
That's what I was going to say.
Ekousios. Yeah. Like, nobody's forcing you to serve. You choose to. You volunteer.
You want to.
I volunteer as tribute. Yeah. That's good.
Shepherd the flock of God among you, overseeing not under compulsion, but willingly, according to God, and not for dishonest gain, but with eagerness. stop there. So that next part, which we didn't really talk about according to God, but what's he saying there? So we have not under compulsion, but willingly, voluntarily.
Nothing to gain, but to help others.
Yeah, you shouldn't be using your position for your own self-indulgent means, because you're meant to be serving the people that you're supposed to be shepherding over.
And I think dishonest gain there also has just such broad implications. But whenever we think of dishonest gain, I think the imagery is in general of like thieves or like people who are ripping somebody off, like almost like a swindler, right? Somebody who's able to get more out of you than you originally wanted to put in.
So I think I know where you're going with this. So he's maybe talking about somebody who's just doing it for a paycheck at the end of the day.
Well, I was saying I think there's a broader. I think that's the imagery he's using, but I think there's a broader aspect to this. And I think it kind of goes to what Nick was saying. Like he's really saying you shouldn't do it out of selfish motives, because that's really what dishonest gain is, right? The gain could be physical. It could literally be a paycheck, right? Maybe you realize that you're a good speaker, and therefore you decide you're going to go into ministry because you realize you can make a quick buck off of it, right? Okay, well that'd be dishonest gain, right? But also there's other ways to do this, right? Dishonest gain would be you say you're doing it for the glory of God when really you're just trying to make a name for yourself, right? Maybe you don't make any money, but at least you get the prestige and the honor, right? Or maybe you just want to be known as the greatest Christian. Okay, well, people might have a lot of respect for you and they might say great things about you, but ultimately you're not doing it for God and you're not doing it for people. You're doing it for yourself, right? And so you are gaining something, but it's very dishonest in how you're doing it, right? Because you are gaining the reputation you desire, but it's dishonest, right? You don't deserve that reputation, right? Because you're not being godly, you are being deceitful. You're actually being like Satan, presenting yourself as an angel of light. And then that's why he contrasts it with eagerness, right? Because eagerness is like you're being genuine, right? Like you genuinely are eager about this. Like you don't have ulterior motives. You're just doing what God genuinely is calling us to do. You can say something about eager?
Well, so it's kind of ironic about that.
What?
Is that the definition of the dishonest gain, aiskokerdos, it means from eagerness for base gain. So it's like still eagerness.
Oh, interesting.
Like it's greedily or in a spirit of eagerness for base gain. I just thought that was funny.
Yeah, that is interesting.
So not for base gain, but eagerly. And that word means readily, eagerly, with a ready mind, or cheerfully. Pro before Thenos passion. Thoroughly willing.
Yeah, I think the idea is like don't do it because you're wanting to get something out of it. Do it because you recognize that there's no greater joy than serving God. That's it. Like just do it because the greatest thing to gain is the service that you give. Or like that is the reward. Right? Like the service is the reward. Set all the other stuff aside. If you end up getting a paycheck, cool. If you end up getting a cool reputation, awesome. If people end up singing your praises, stay humble. Right? But ultimately, do it cheerfully. Right? And don't do it out of some compulsion or anything. Like, no, just do it because you're being a genuine person who wants to serve the Lord and be eager about it. Be enthusiastic. Right? You should be like, wow, I get to go, serve people. I'm not, I gotta serve people. But like, we laugh about it, but that's how we talk sometimes.
Yeah.
Right? As Christians, we talk about denying ourselves like it's supposed to be some like laborious task. I've got to deny myself. I've got to do this. And I think that's because we're still kind of clinging to the world. Right? Whereas I think that we're supposed to be counting it joy to deny ourselves. Not that that makes it easier. I'm just saying that it's supposed to be an exciting process because what you have to gain is better than what you're losing. But the thing you're gaining is not physical in nature. Right? What you're gaining is a clean conscience before God. Right? And you are gaining the opportunity to serve the God of creation. And that should be the reward in and of itself. And I don't know. We should just be joyful at that. It's like, yeah, guys, we have to serve God together. This is awesome. We get to deny ourselves and like serve others. Sweet, like that's awesome. I mean, other people would be bummed out by that, but we get to like share in like Christ's example. That's awesome. Like, I think that's how the mindset's would be different.
Yeah, it's not necessarily relevant to Peter specifically, but like that's one cool thing about Paul. Like even Paul will say like that, you know, the worker deserves their wage. He's not saying that like pastors shouldn't get paid necessarily, but just the fact that he didn't accept money and just so that people wouldn't even think that he was doing it for the money
Yeah.
reasons. Because it's one thing to like know in your mind, but another thing, like you can know in your head all you want that you're not doing it for that reason, but he wasn't even willing for people to think that.
You don't want to be a stumbling block.
Yeah, he didn't want to be a stumbling block.
Paul's just like, the more I think about Paul, he's just a cool dude. Like, he probably wasn't super fun to be around, if I'm being entirely honest. Like, because I'm sure that he probably took things more seriously than a lot of people wanted to. But when you just reflect on little quirks in his character, like things he didn't have to do but he chose to do, just a cool guy. Like how much he gave up. I don't know. Sorry, I know that we're not even talking about Paul right now because we're funeral, but still,
Yeah,
just a cool guy.
but just that's an example,
Yeah.
for sure. Which again, the whole point being is that they need to be an example. But any-
Yeah.
okay.
Sorry, somebody yawned when I was commenting them.
Anything else there for verse 2? So, and not for dishonest or base gain, but with eagerness.
Nor yet lording over those who lie to you. Maybe, I think we already kind of touched on this briefly. He's like alluding to.
Don't
What?
abuse your authority. Don't use it as like.
Oh, okay, now I see it. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what lording it over someone means.
Yeah,
It's
no,
like
I read that wrong.
Yeah.
I read it wrong.
it's like using your position to sort of force something onto someone else, like your own.
I'm in charge, not you.
Yeah,
Right.
holding it as above someone's head, so to speak.
Right. And
Like I'm in this position, not you. Therefore, you should follow.
Yeah. AKA, don't act like a junior hire.
Yeah.
I guess that could go a couple different ways because, like we've been talking about, like not abusing it in the sense of like, you know, I'm the one in charge, do what I say. But there is also like kind of go back to like the dishonest gain. You know, it's kind of like what was their names?
Is it
Hophni?
House and Sapphira?
Hmm?
I have no idea. I don't know.
Oh, I was thinking of like Old Testament. Is it Hophni and Phinehas? The ones.
Oh, the sons of Aaron?
Yeah, or
Yes.
or
Or no, sons of
Eli.
Eli.
Yeah.
I think Hophni and Phinehas. Or, crud, I'm getting them all mixed together.
Phineas?
I'll look it up. I got you.
Hophni and
Okay.
Phineas?
Just tell the story.
Just yeah, I guess it's not much of a story, but like one issue in the beginning of 1 Samuel was that Eli, he was the high priest. His
Yeah.
two sons, I'm pretty sure it was Hophni.
It was
Phinehas.
Hophni and Phinehas.
Okay, yeah, they were the high priest's sons, but they were actually abusing their position to, I mean, quite literally for base gain. Like they were getting like the fat from the offerings, and then they were like sleeping with people, like the women. I guess they like come to like the tabernacle. I forget exactly how it worded it, but either way, they would use their position to.
For
What's the word?
personal gain.
Yeah, just exploit.
Yeah.
Exploit people, and also to like, well, exploit people either way, but they were stealing from God and also exploiting people. But that's just all that was just to give an example of like
I think.
what you could do in that position, you know.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, but I do think that in addition to this being a continuation of what he's already commanding them to do, he's basically saying to them, you know, don't, like, you have to show these people why you're in a position of leadership by being an example. You don't just say, well, I'm a leader, therefore you have to follow. Show these people why they should be following you, by being an example to them of what you're trying to teach. And living what you teach basically is the best way to show those people, you know, okay, this is how I should be living.
Leading by example.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably a practical, probably another practical reason for this too. Just is like back then. I mean, now we literally have this on the screen to look at, but I mean, realistically speaking, most of the people that they're being called a shepherd, I mean, they would have gotten this in a letter at church, but someone's house. But it's not like everyone probably had a personal copy of this letter to read. So practically speaking, the primary way that these people would get these principles is from the elders.
Yeah.
Like, they wouldn't necessarily have their own Bible to read. So it's not like if their leadership failed, they would have like 100% fallback, you know? So they probably also, I mean, in that sense, there was a little more responsibility, especially on these people in leadership, because at least you didn't have the excuse of, oh, well, our leadership stinks, but at least everyone has their own copy, so they could still do it. That's just like a practical.
Unless Peter was writing that many copies.
Right. Well, I guess at that point they would have just copied it there. Which, I mean, eventually they did make copies, obviously, because we still have manuscripts.
I kind of feel like he at least wrote a couple copies, but I don't know.
Yeah.
But still.
What was I gonna say? Just another thing that he's doing here. Just because I think it's also supposed to be read in context of the other leadership he's already talked about so far.
Mm-hmm.
He's specifically contrasting how they should be as leaders versus the other leaders who do abuse them, right? Like, because ultimately they're supposed to submit to authority no matter what, but you want to, like, if you can be a good leader who sets a good example, you can teach people how to submit with joy, right? Because they'll find joy in submitting to you. And if you, their leader, are telling them, like, if you are willing to love them and teach them to submit under good leadership, then they'll be more inclined to listen to you whenever you advise them to submit joyfully to bad leadership, right? Just because they'll be like, wow, so this person isn't just telling us to submit to bad leadership so that he can be a bad leader. No, like if we're supposed to submit no matter what, he could be a bad leader, but he's not. He's choosing to be a good leader. For just because he loves us, right? And then I think a lot of the things he's highlighting here, it kind of brings back to mind 1 Samuel again, because the stuff he's highlighting here are the exact opposite of what worldly leaders do, right? If you remember, whenever the people asked Samuel for a king, and Samuel basically gave them this long speech saying, here's what worldly kings do. And he said they take. And basically all the stuff that Samuel said that worldly kings do are the things that Peter is saying to not do here, right? So as a leader, you have to be non-worldly, right? Worldly leaders, they will lead under compulsion, right? They'll just do it because they have to, right? Maybe they wanted to at the beginning, but eventually they'll just do it because, like, it's part of the job, right? They lose the willingness of it, right? They will not do it according to God. They'll do it according to the world. They will do it for dishonest gain. They will do it without eagerness, right? If it's just like, I mean, they'll be eager for dishonest gain, but they will not be eager for just like goodness, right? They will lord it over people like who are under them, right? Think of just politicians, right? Politicians, are any of us going to say that they're like, can we think of a single politician who isn't in it for dishonest gain? I mean, I guess I don't know the hearts of them, but I naturally kind of just go into like voting and stuff like that, assuming that the politicians have some sort of dishonest gain that like they're not telling us, right? I mean, maybe I'm just skeptical, but in general, like I don't think I've ever voted for a politician assuming that their motives were entirely out in the open, right? I've just never assumed that, right? I just always assume, okay, there are probably a lot of stuff they're not telling us. I'm just going to go off of what they're saying, right?
Yeah.
Because just naturally, all these things are things that you see worldly leaders doing. And so he's saying, don't be like that, right? The temptation is going to be like that. Like if you are a broken person in a leadership position over broken people, your natural temptation is going to be to act like the broken world around you, and you're going to want to act like a worldly leader. And he's saying, don't do it. Right? He says, you've got to, like, in your leadership position, you are the prime example for the people. You have to choose to be part of the solution. I don't know if that makes sense, but hopefully it does.
No, it does. Anything else there in verse 3? Nor yet as lording it over those allotted to you, but being examples to the flock. It's not anything that important, but I do think it's kind of interesting that those are the two things being contrasted as like being opposites. Which makes sense because you really can't be an example to the flock while abusing your authority. But
well, yeah, because you're not one, like, you're also setting an example by you're showing them what good authority looks like, right? Because you're the elder of the church. I mean, they might have leadership positions in different ways, right? Some of the people that you're leading, they're fathers, right? Okay, well, a father needs to know how to lead, and as their elder, you're going to show them an example. And if you are constantly using your authority in a lording way, well, now guess what? You just gave them at least one example that they could use to justify acting the same way towards their kids, right? Because now they'll say, oh, well, this is how our pastor treats us, so of course we can treat you that way. And so it's once again highlighting that leaders will be held to a higher standard, right? If you're a leader, you have to realize that you're also leading other people who are potentially leaders in different ways, right? Maybe they're a father, maybe they're a slave owner, maybe they're an elder brother, right? Every one of us has a position where we are having influence on other people, right? Whether we realize it or not. And so if you find yourself in a leadership position, you have to realize that you're walking a careful line, because the example you set will basically give people opportunities to, like, if you don't set the right example, you might be the reason why people justify sinning by also setting a bad example.
another thing too, I mean, it's again not necessarily that important, but the word lording, it's actually it's definitely like the best way to translate that, I'd say, because the word literally is just kata plus like kurion.
You know,
So-
according to a Lord.
Yeah, or like exercising lordship over.
Yeah.
But also to me, like the idea is, I mean, if you're lording it over them, then that idea is that you are like presenting yourself as like their lord, whereas the whole thing in all of this is that you are not greater than them, and so like you aren't their lord. And so another thing of like being the example is like in all of this, like even though you are in like their authority over them, you're still submitting to Christ as Lord. And so part of it is also like shepherding them as both being people who have Christ as their Lord, and so it's pointing them to Christ versus pointing them to you, I guess, if that makes sense. So it's still Christ focused, not self focused. Anything else there? Okay. Which I guess makes sense because in verse 4 he mentions the chief shepherd. And when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the unfading crown of glory. What's he saying there?
Since you show what good examples are, you'll receive around unfavored favor. You'll be a favor, like what I mean by that is since you're doing the right thing, he sees that you're doing the right thing, he will show you favor on his side.
Mm-hmm. Another thing he's doing is, as always, kind of reminding them of the future of the day of Revelation to kind of help sober their minds. That's kind of been the whole thing, right? Is within mind the hope of the future, Christ returning, the day of the day of Revelation. That's supposed to actually help sober your mind and gird your minds for action. And so, it's one thing just to say all these things because whatever, but it all has like a specific thing in mind, which is that eventually the chief shepherd is going to appear. And so if you are someone in authority over people and you are presiding over them, being their Lord, aka you're basically taking Christ's place, what are you going to do whenever he shows up? If you're, this honestly really does go back to like the Gospel of John with the my sheep know my voice, and he contrasts him as the good shepherd with those who are thieves and robbers. The idea is that you don't want to be a thief or a robber, who I think he even specifically describes them as people who do it under compulsion and for money and for gain. And those are the people who break in and steal his sheep. The idea is that you're not here to steal Christ's sheep, because you're over them and they're your flock, but ultimately they're Jesus' sheep. The only reason that they're your sheep in a sense is because you have been given this position by God and you are leading them, shepherding them to God.
I just love the imagery of like chief shepherd, like you're saying, like you're almost like the attendant, right? He's the chief shepherd, right? You're taking care of his sheep. I just like that, like, I don't know, there's like hierarchy, right? It's like he's got this huge flock and he's appointed different people to take care of, basically split the flock in groups. You're responsible for your flock. When the chief shepherd appears, you want to make sure that you've taken care of them well. Like, that's just kind of cool imagery.
Right.
And you kind of alluded to this. I also just love the, I don't know, like you alluded to the fact that basically this whole book has been pointing to the return of Christ. Mm-hmm. I just love how saturated, especially like whenever you look at the New Testament letters, how focused the early church was on his return. That's something where I've been trying to get us more in that mindset in our group. But in general, the American church just isn't that like the only time we talk about the return of Christ is like when we're going through Revelation. And if you ask people about the like the hope of Christ's return, most people would say that it's only mentioned in Revelation because that's all they think of. But whenever you read the New Testament, it's like almost every passage. Well, I would actually argue that probably like the New Testament makes more references to his return than it does to his death, right? Like it's just built on it. Like to them, like to the early church, that is what they're longing for, and I just love how subtly he brings it up, right? It's like, one moment he's just talking about very practical stuff, right? Be a good leader in your church. The very next moment, what is he saying? And when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the unfading crown of glory. Like to him, those things go hand in hand. Whereas for us, whenever we think about the return of Jesus, we think of like, I don't know, being poofed up to heaven or something like that. It's like, no. Like, there are very practical implications. Like, if he is coming back, that changes so much. But maybe it's because we've been waiting 2,000 years, we've lost our, urgency behind it. But for the early church, that was, fuel for the fire. It's like, hey, he's coming back. And he expects us to be, living faithfully. The way Jesus puts it in the Gospels, he says, when the Son of Man returns to earth, will he find any faith? Right? He expects us to be bearing fruit. And that is our motivation for living for him. It's not simply, oh man, I want to go to heaven, therefore I better be a good Christian. It's like, no. No, the one that you love is coming back. And you will stand before him one day. And you have to look him in the eyes. And yes, there will be rewards, but I don't even think that we're going to care about any crowns or something like that. I think what we're going to care about is the look in his eyes whenever we have to give an account for all that we've done. And I don't know, that's fuel for the fire. And I just love how subtly he just drops it in there. When the chief shepherd appears, he's just confident, right? Not if. And he doesn't take time to speculate when that's going to be. He just says, this is going to happen, right? The chief shepherd, he is coming back. And you'll receive that unfading crown of glory. And I don't know, I just think there's probably more to that. I just love like just the worldview of the early, like of the apostles, right? In comparison to us, like they just, you can tell that they are in a state of longing, right? Whereas for us, I think maybe it's just because we're so used to the prosperity of our current lives, like we kind of lack that longing, because in many ways, I mean, I know we complain a lot about life as we currently have it, but I mean, whenever people think about heaven in America, their biggest concern is that heaven might be boring, which tells you that maybe we've got it pretty good here, because obviously heaven doesn't even sound relieving to people, because they're like, oh, that says that they've got it pretty good here, right? Because it's like, oh, apparently you're doing so good that you think that this place is better than heaven, whereas from the biblical worldview, this place is basically hell. So it tells us that we don't have a very good glimpse of heaven, but it also shows how overwhelmed, like how much our prosperity and our privilege has kind of is blinded us to where we don't even long for eternity anymore. We're just like, like I think there's a Johnny Cash song that says something along the lines of like, they want the kingdom but they don't want God in it, right? It's like we're like, oh yeah, I can't wait to be to heaven, but like we're not excited about the Jesus part. We're excited about like, oh yeah, no more tears. No, it's like, guys, I don't know, like the early church, they weren't like that. The early church, they are literally in a state of longing, and they want to be free of this present world, and they want to be with their Savior. And that's probably because they suffered so much. We haven't suffered that way, and so for us, we're like, I don't know, I like it pretty good here. We got matcha tea, and we got air conditioning. Things are going pretty great. I don't know, Jesus, take your time. Jesus, come back, but wait until I get married or something. It's like that's kind of how we act. Whereas for them, they're like, no, like we want Jesus to come back no matter what. Like it's like their driving ambition. That's the longing of their souls. Whereas for us, the only reason we talk about the return of Christ is because we like speculating about the end times, which is a totally different thing. And I imagine if the apostles showed up, they'd be frustrated at how unenthused we are by his return. Whereas for them, they're like, yeah, guys, I can't wait to see him. It's just like they're excited about it.
Yeah. I think another thing here that's kind of been throughout the book, really, because I mean, really, even it goes back to the whole suffering theme. But again, the idea of, like in verse 4, the idea of, like, what's the word? Not humiliation necessarily, like humbleness, or it's like, I'm trying to think of just the word form, but basically like humble and then like exaltation. So like there's the suffering and then there's the glory.
Well, I think humiliation is probably the right word. We just use it differently nowadays.
Yeah, but like this idea of like humiliation, like again, part of what he's commanding the elders to do is a form of like humbling themselves, like realizing that they're not the chief shepherd, and so it's not their job. Like they're not there to gain things out of their position. They're there to simply, shepherd the flock they've been given. And so when they humble themselves and shepherd their flock with eagerness and all this other stuff, when the chief shepherd comes, and that's in the future time that we don't know, then they will be exalted, crown of glory. Which is kind of a recurring theme throughout the letter, as the different groups of people are called to basically suffer, and then later on there is going to be some kind of day of glory and like salvation of sorts, if that makes sense.
I'm kind of going to go off topic again, but I'm going to kind of rant country music. But David was talking about a minute ago how like people don't want, or not like, or just kind of show here we have it good here. Like Hank Williams Jr. wrote a song of heaven. Like if heaven ain't a lot like Dixie, I don't want to go. So.
Well, no, there's a lot of songs like that. There's also the what's that one? I mean, there's that one country artist. He was really popular for a bit. I don't remember what was it. Was his name Kane something?
Kane Brown.
Kane Brown, is that what it was?
Yes.
Didn't he have a song about a girl where it was like talking about heaven? It was like heaven's in your arms, something like
being
that.
with her was like in heaven or
Just,
something like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, but like the whole thing is saying that like heaven can't be better than this or something like that.
Yeah,
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
or
yeah,
you even
yeah,
got the
yeah.
one song, the what is it, Hosier, like "Take Me to Church,"
Whoa.
Yeah.
right? That's oh my gosh. This is a funny story. Like my students, like one of them was like playing that in class, and they're like, and I was like, guys, why are you playing that? Like, you realize that's inappropriate, right? They're like, what? It's about church. I'm like, oh my gosh. I was like, guys, like this was like last year. I was like, guys, just take my word on it. As your Bible teacher, I don't think I'm allowed to explain these lyrics to you, but go ask your parents about it, or just go Google the lyrics and just read them. All because it says church in it does not mean it's about church. but what I'm highlighting there, it kind of ties into that. I don't know. I'm a big fan of music and movies. Say a lot about our culture, right? And so if you know anything about me, I analyze everything, right? I can't listen to music without analyzing it. I cannot watch a movie without analyzing it. And I think that it just teaches you a lot about cultural values. And the fact that you even have songs like that is crazy, right? Keep in mind, these people, they're not writing these songs, I don't think. I mean, they're trying to be a little bit controversial, but like, they're not really writing these songs, you know, as a to make a theological point. To them, it just sounds good, right? But the thing is, songs usually are supposed to reflect what you are genuinely emotionally feeling. And so from the perspective, you're saying, if heaven's not a lot like Dixie, I don't want to go. I mean, is he making a theological assertion? No. Because I would think Hank Williams Jr., if you, like he claims to be a Christian, right? So obviously, I think he does want to go to heaven. But the fact that you feel that way, right? Once again, you could argue that we're reading too much into it, but just that the thought would even cross your mind to begin with tells you, oh wow, our values must be a little bit wrong, right? Even if he doesn't take it seriously, right? The fact that the mere thought would cross your mind. And I don't think it's just him. I think thoughts have crossed our mind like that. If I'm being honest, like, there's stuff I've thought about, I'm like, oh man, that's not going to be like that in heaven? Like, that's a bummer. And I'm like, oh, wow. Like, I realized for a second, I'm like, wow, my values are so wrong, right? Like, I'm almost thinking that I could run heaven better than God. Like, and that shows that I don't have a proper view of eternity. And so, but there's so many songs like that in, like, just modern day culture that it shows you that, in general, our world doesn't understand it well. Which, to be fair, our culture isn't claiming to be Christian. But it testifies to the general, it shows you what people genuinely do worship, right? If he says that, you know, holding a girl in his arms is better than heaven, well, that tells you who his God really is, right? Because, I mean, obviously, he finds great comfort in this woman, right? If we don't yearn for heaven, well, that's probably because we idolize the comfort that we have here on earth. I don't know. That's just stuff worth reflecting on. Obviously, the culture doesn't claim to be Christian, but examining the culture will maybe highlight issues in our own heart, if that makes sense.
Yeah, honestly, I guess technically it wouldn't be as big of a deal, like, in theory, if it wasn't for the fact that we probably are more affected by the culture than we'd like to think.
Yeah, that's the main issue, right? It's not like, we obviously can't get mad at worldly people for being worldly, but I think that in many ways, most Christians are being influenced more by the culture than by the Bible, because people just aren't reading their Bibles and they're not studying them, and they're definitely not studying them rightly. So, I mean, most people, their view of love is derived. I mean, even my students. For those of you who walked in earlier, you might have noticed I clicked off the screen really quickly. And that's because I was kind of ashamed of what I was watching when y'all walked in. Not that it was anything like overtly dirty, but Brianne and I turned on the show Love Island, right? And that's because a lot of my students have been watching it, right? And I whenever I hear that my students are watching stuff like that, I try to watch it. And it's just so interesting because it shows so much about culture. And I'm not gonna lie, part of it's kind of entertaining, but it just says so much about culture and the values. And the students that watch it, they're not like, it was a group of girls, but they're not like that worldly from, you know, like within our school. I mean, they're probably some of the better girls who go to the school when it comes from like a godly perspective. Yet they love this show. And from their perspective, they're like, that's what love, they understand that's not exactly what love is, but they're being shaped by it. or like watching The Bachelor or something like that. It's like our students watch that stuff, and they're being shaped by it, right? To where their view of love is being dictated more by those things than they are by the Bible. And so I don't even know how we got to that. I guess we're talking about the unfading crown of glory and Christ appearing and like dwelling with Him, and how that should be our chief ambition, whereas our values are often too rooted in almost treating this world like paradise.
Yeah, I mentioned like the humiliation and glory, and then you
Yeah.
mentioned just like the prevalence of Jesus' return being mentioned in the New Testament.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I yeah, that's definitely true. But honest, to tie that in back to this, like, especially for his audience, that's a big reason why there is this calling for these leaders to be a good example, because I mean, we have the Bible to study, whereas they wouldn't have really had like a personal Bible to study, so they're being influenced by either the world or by their fellow Christians. They don't necessarily have the text to actually counterbalance that.
Yeah, like we can at least test things, right? Like if we see something that's weird on a TV show, we can be like, whoa, let's see if that lines up with Scripture. Whereas for them, I mean, their leaders were their example. So
Yeah.
And that's why leaders were judged more strictly.
exactly, it all makes sense.
Yep. Anything else there for verse 4? You'll receive the unfading crown of glory.
Oh my gosh, we're gonna get through 5 verses today. This is wild. This is like unheard of stuff.
All right. You younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders. Just stop there. What does he say in there? I mean, it's not a trick question.
For the young generation, the younger generation respect your older generation.
AKA, he's asking them to do the unthinkable.
Yes. Yes.
But because we naturally do not like respecting elders.
Anything else there?
So
That part, I mean, we've already been talking a lot about
the
that.
last tangent we had.
Yeah, well, so we've already been talking a lot about the whole.
That's interesting. The word for younger men, it is like, it's neos, which literally just means like new. Like,
Mhm.
it's almost like newborn. Like, he's obviously not talking about genuine newborns. He's not giving an instruction to infants. But that's the imagery, right? It's like, you've got the elders, who are the leaders, and then the younger men are the infants, right? They're the, I don't know, I just think like that, the imagery, that's kind of cool.
Could it be that, or could it also be like newer Christians? Like,
It could be. Yeah, so so the elders could be the elders of the faith, and then, like the younger ones, yeah. That could be true. I mean, I don't know which one he probably has in mind, but both would apply.
but yeah, for
Right?
sure. both
Younger
apply.
people should respect older people, but younger Christians should also, walk in humility to older Christians. And it could just be like, it could not even necessarily be speaking in terms of time, right? It could be just a more like the immature walk in reverence and be subject to the mature, right?
Mhm.
If that makes sense, but
Yeah. Well, yeah, because at least, relatively speaking, I mean, the implication is that the elders are more mature than the younger. So whether it's like new Christians or younger people or immature, it's all the same.
yeah.
Is that-
Well, and also he's just teaching principles, and so like this could be expanded to any sort of different category. Just like any situation where there is some sort of power dynamic or the temptation to not be subject to somebody.
Yeah. Which I guess is kind of the opposite thing, but it kind of makes me think of like Timothy, where he encourages him not to be like, I'm trying to think exactly how he words it, but just basically like that people like
And
to
then no one
not
despise you for your youth.
yeah, that whole thing. Because that would be kind of the opposite if you're going with like older, but I mean, the principle is still there for sure. Because Timothy was someone who was very mature in the faith,
Yeah.
but there could have been more immature Christians that may have been older in age. They could have been be unwilling to submit. But either way, there is this calling to ultimately just being subject to authority or to people who have something to like teach you. So you have to be willing to be taught or corrected, all those things, rebuked, which isn't always easy, if ever.
Yeah. We can see why he'd have to give this command. Be subject to your elders. Why? Exactly. Because we just don't like that command.
Yeah.
I had to give a lecture to my students about that today. They have this thing where, so technically they're not allowed to eat in class, right? Because honestly, it's mainly because they leave a mess everywhere. And they're always like, I'm not going to leave a mess. It's like, okay, everybody says they're not going to leave a mess, but every day I have to clean up a mess. So like, one of you's doing it and one of you's just lying. And so I had to get on to them today. And these ones, honestly, are pretty good kids. They would not make a mess. But I had to get on to them. I was like, hey, like, let's not eat. And they're like, why not? I'm like, well, because it's against the rules. And they're like, but nobody has to know. And I'm like, well, God would know. And I honestly fear him knowing more than I fear my boss knowing. But even if nobody knew, I would still be disobeying my boss. And in disobeying my boss, I'm teaching you that you don't have to subject yourself to authority. And that's just setting you up for all sorts of failure. Because first off, you're supposed to be listening to me as your teacher. And so if I teach you that I don't listen to my boss, then why should you listen to me? And if you're not willing to listen to me or listen to your principal, then why the heck would you listen to God? And so like it was like how it all just like kind of ties together. But they're like, oh, we don't want to listen. I'm like, I get that. I understand. Naturally, you don't want to. And I know that you think it's silly because you think us old people are just like, curmudgeons who don't like you eating your Cheez-Its. But you just need to listen. And I'm asking you to just help me out. but it just ties into the fact that we just don't like subjecting ourselves. Right? We like to do our own thing. And we like to eat. Also, what's so frustrating is that they always eat, it's like the period before lunch. Sorry, that's not relevant to anything else I'm saying. It's just like, it's aggravating because none of the other class periods want to eat. It's always the period right before lunch. I'm like, do y'all have that little self-control? Like, you have made it several hours, and now you have 40 minutes left, and now you just can't hold yourself back anymore? What is this? It's just ridiculous. I'm like, I would understand it if it's third period, right? It's all right, we're halfway through, we're, we got a little ways from breakfast, we're away from lunch, I'm gonna eat now. No, nobody eats during that class. It's always the class right before lunch. I'm like, it's silly. There's nothing theological about that. I just had to rant for a second.
All good.
Well, it does go to show that whenever we want something or we're hungry or something like that, and we want something to eat and we don't have it, we want to go get food and eat when we want.
Yeah, I started making them feel really guilty by every time they start eating during the period before lunch. I just say, hey, is there ever a moment in your life where you don't submit to the lust of your flesh or something like that? Where I make it sound like it's the most grave thing ever. They're like, oh my gosh. I'm like, yeah. Why are you acting like a slave to your flesh? Do you not have any self-discipline? And they're like, oh my gosh, Mr. Tate. I'm like, stop eating. But anyways.
You would have hated me as a student, David.
Probably.
I would have just snapped you out. I'd be one of those guys who's
I did too, but it's just I think in a lot of schools they don't really mind. I don't know.
Yeah,
but,
no, most 90% of my teachers didn't care.
Yeah. And honestly, I usually don't care, but ever since we did the whole submit to authority thing back several months ago, whatever, when we were 2 chapters ago or whatever, I just felt super convicted about that. To where I'm like, okay, I don't personally care, but all because I care doesn't mean I shouldn't implement the rule. It's like, no, if this is the rule that the people above me have set in place, it's not my job. Like, what I should care about is submitting to them, right? Even if I don't understand the rule, right? Because if I set the example like, oh, you only have to apply the rules that you care about, well, that's not really, you're not going to get people walking in obedience to God through that, because then they're only going to obey the things that they care about, right?
Right. At the very least, it's not teaching the right mindset behind it.
Exactly.
Okay, we can move on to the last part of verse 5. And all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, for God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
That last part comes from Proverbs 3:34.
Yeah.
He's quoted Proverbs a few times.
Yeah, that one's quoted a few times throughout the New Testament. I'm pretty sure. I think it's
in James.
James. Yeah. What does he say in there? I think it's imagery.
Be humble. Instead of being all about yourself, all about pride in you, consider other people more important than yourself.
I
Look
think
at others.
there's a reason that pride is one of the 7 cardinal sins, as they're so called, and it's because it really is a driving force behind, self-indulgent ways of living, and if you're doing this all because you have so much pride in yourself that you're not pointing more towards being in service of others, it really causes you to be blinded by that and to not, you're only living for yourself. You're not living for anyone else. Because, if you're God's gift to the world, then, what's
Well, yeah.
the
Then
point in being of service to others?
you start feeling entitled to things that other people don't deserve, or that you feel other people don't deserve, and I mean, even just the, that's not why he says he's quoting the proverb, but like grace. I mean, the gospel inherently is not something that you deserve. Everyone. The gospel is not something that any of us can earn, and none of us deserve it. The whole point is that it is great. Like grace and mercy, by definition, are things that we, I guess, in a sense, neither deserve or deserve to get, but don't get. So just to what you're saying, yeah. I mean, to be proud is to put yourself above others and to withhold, like it can result in you withholding from people like the grace that God has given to you, which is obviously like putting yourself above other people. But it all also just, it's not that it's necessarily summarizing the previous verses, but it's addressed to everybody. But really within all of this, because this is all, it's not necessarily that it's just about church unity, but it is all kind of in light of that. It's just a lot easier to carry these things out whenever you are everyone is humble towards each other.
When no one feels like they're better than the person next to them.
I also just like the imagery of clothing yourself with humility,
Yeah.
because I don't know. We talk about how we need to get rid of pride, right? And so it's almost like we are naturally, as humans, we are clothed with pride, right? It's like that is the garment we wear every single day. It's what governs most of our decisions. Usually, the reasons why we do most things in the day, it's pride, right? If you're genuinely trying to figure out what your motives are, like just reflect for a moment and you'll realize, oh wow, most of the things I do are pride. Most of the things that I say, it's because I'm trying to gain something out of what I'm communicating and stuff. But whenever you get rid of pride, it's not that we're supposed to just stay naked, right? No, we have to choose to clothe ourselves with humility, right? The imagery of clothing is it's an intentional choice, right? You are taking something off, you are exchanging those clothes for something else, and every day you are choosing to clothe yourself with humility, right? You are going like humility. That's not a natural inclination for us. Naturally, we are proud people, right? That's why pride is at the root of literally every sin we've committed. But you're choosing to clothe yourself, and that's just like I don't know. That's literally a choice you have to make day by day, moment by moment. And he doesn't just direct this at the elders or the younger men. He directs it at everybody, because ultimately, the reason why elders would abuse their power is because of pride. The reason why young men would not submit to elders is because of pride. The reason why none of us want to submit to the authorities above us is because of pride. The reason why we would lash out in retaliation and vengeance against people who persecute us, pride. Right? The reason why we would break church unity, pride. Right? So literally every single issue he's talked about throughout the whole letter ultimately is fixed by one phrase: clothe yourself with humility. If you can do that, boom, all the rest will fall into place. The issue is that command right there is probably the hardest of all the commands. I don't know, like, for me, you can ask me and I'll just tell you right up, I've got a lot of pride, right? But you know who I never believe? The people who tell me that they don't have any pride. I've heard people say that, they're like, I'm not a proud person. I'm like, okay, you're just a person who's not very self-aware. That's what you are. Because everybody is proud. The issue is we recognize it to various degrees, and it's better for us to recognize it so we can keep it in check.
All of us are.
Yeah.
Also.
It's not the same, like, and the imagery is a bit different, but it kind of reminds me of from chapter 2. Therefore, laying aside all malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation if you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. It's not the exact same, but to me it's still like the idea of
Laying aside.
you having to lay aside, things that, you may like be inclined or tempted towards, or just things you're like harboring in your mind. You're kind of called to lay it aside, to hang the coat, take it off, and to put on something else.
I think this isn't necessarily about the, comparing humility with pride, but I often feel that among the list of the 7 sins, as they're called, you can kind of almost overlook pride, even though it's one of them. But it really is probably the sin we commit the most. Like, it is our most consistent,
Yeah, well,
Well, it lies at the root of all of them.
yeah.
it lies at the root of all of them, and I think it's also because our view of it is also very downplayed. Like, I mean,
And our culture encourages it. You need to take some pride in yourself. Okay.
right, it's all about your time, and everything's about you and advancing yourself.
Yeah.
Which, again, if you're rooted in the world and this life is all, like, this world and this life is all there is, then it makes sense that you are kind of the center of your own, that you'd be the center of your own life. But it's the fact that there is a God, and there is a good God, and that, Jesus went and came and died and is coming back. All those things change that. But if you don't have that hope, then, in a sense, pride, I guess, wouldn't really be a bad thing. Because, your life would be all about yourself. So, thankfully, that's not the case. But
Well, I kind of piggyback what you're saying there. I don't know if this sin is pride, but it's like there's pride in self, and I think it's rooting yourself in that's wrong. It's like it's okay to have a self, and maybe there's a time where it's okay to have some pride. The problem is like you're saying, being a believer in God changes. It's not only about yourself. There's more to
In
it.
fact,
so.
it shouldn't be about yourself at all.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, it has a lot to do with how you view yourself,
I mean,
especially in relation to others, but also God too.
there's nothing wrong with feeling good after doing something good. That's how inherently it's supposed to feel. But like,
Well, it's just a matter of what you do with that.
Exactly.
I don't know if there is, but I went through something to pride where you know heard about selfless. Doesn't mean to think less of yourself, but think of yourself
That's
less.
a human instinct.
I think it's like that. It's like we have distorted views on it, and it just we are prone to being clothed in selfishness and pride, and something about God and His grace is able to change people to not. That's not the case. You know, not to be so prideful, but still be able to function, to be not to be selfish, but to instead be selfless.
Yeah, one thing that I told my cross country runners this past week, we did a little devotional, and I was just talking about their race, and I told them, like, guys, I'm going to apologize to you ahead of time because I'm about to prove that I'm the worst coach of all time. But I told them that ultimately I do not care how they do at the race tomorrow. Right? I said, I don't care. And I know that sounds really bad as a coach, and that if any of my other coaches heard me say that, they'd probably tell me to not say stuff like that. But I said I genuinely don't care because ultimately it's about how they react. And I told them that they could run the best race of their life, but if they got arrogant because of it, going forward I will pray that they run worse races. Just because, to me, I don't care as much about how fast they run. I care more about their character. And there's nothing inherently wrong with having a sense of achievement and giving your all, but it's what you do with that, right? Do you use that to thank God and glorify Him and think, wow, God, thank you for making me able to do that? Or do you do it to think, man, I'm awesome? Because I've had runners on my team who have been like, oh, I'm awesome, and they thought they hung the moon, and I didn't want them running good races. Because the thing is, it affected the whole team. And it affected their heart, and you could tell that it was like they were becoming very big-headed, and I think maybe I was that way a little bit, so it's easier for me to spot it. Like I see too much of myself in them. But I was like, guys, you can run the best race of your life. If you get cocky, I'm not going to be happy for you. You can run the worst race of your life, and if you throw a fit, I'm not going to pity you. Right? It's ultimately about the humility.
I think God cares about your character. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's why it said that it's how you play the game. It's about how you treat other people, how you view yourself is a part of that, because you know the greatest commandment: love yourself and love God and love others. Like treat your neighbor as yourself. Like the way you play the game affects how you're constantly treating others, and I think God wants us to treat others with a certain amount of fairness and kindness, and not to be too proudful.
Yep.
Not to get big-headed and all that.
Yes, sir.
But like you're saying, it's interesting because you can win the game and be first place and still have a bad attitude.
Yes.
Yep.
So you want to consistently try to have a good attitude. Be a gracious winner.
Yep.
What do you call it, graciousness? Like, if you win.
I think it's just humility.
Yeah, humility. Yeah.
Yep.
Anything else there for I guess the first half of verse 5? Because we haven't talked about the last part. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
I think we sort of talked about that part because what David was talking about is if you're proud about what you do, I'm gonna pray that you run worse races.
Mm-hmm.
So we've kind of talked about it.
Well, sort of. We talked about the humility and stuff in general, and being that way towards each other. But I mean, he could have just ended it at clothe yourselves to humility towards one another, because he didn't really give like a reason in verses 1 through 4.
I think the reason God's opposed to pride, my definition of pride being self-esteem, is because like we're talking about, there's a sense of self where it's like, oh, it's just about me and only me. And I'm the number one here. I'm the best, right? And you're right, if you're ignorant of God or even not aware of others and being able to respect others, God as opposed to proud, because that's like you're inflating yourself, but you're not, glorifying or even just making mention of God, like, paying respects, just like being humble and saying like, no, God is greater, God is good, like we're blessed by Him, and I think that's why it's put in pride, because it actually separates you from God. To be selfish separates you from God. God is more of a giving force, more of a source of good. Yeah, He graces the humble.
Real quick, I want to drop a scary thought.
Okay.
And then I know we probably have to wrap up pretty quick. But who is Peter writing to?
The Jewish Christians.
Yeah, but just in general,
Gentile?
just Christians, right? He's writing to Christians. And he quotes this proverb. God is opposed to the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. But keep in mind, he is writing to Christians. So from Peter's perspective, there is a genuine reality where as a Christian, God can be opposed to you. That's what he's warning them against. Right? That's something that doesn't line up with a lot of people's theology at times. That's not saying that you're losing your salvation or something. It's saying that there are times where you can be doing something and God will actively be working against you and He hates what you're doing. Even as a Christian. Right? A lot of times people don't think that. Right? Oh, I'm a Christian, therefore God loves everyone. No. If you're proud, God will be opposed to that. That's why I didn't mind saying that during the cross-country thing. Most people would not like that though. Right? You're going to pray that they run worse races because they got proud? Yes, I will. A lot of people would not think that that's what a Christian should do. But the thing is, I don't want them to be proud. Because if I allow them to excel in pride, it's better for them to be opposed by me than opposed by God. So I would rather pray that God humbles them quickly so that God doesn't have to oppose them. Right? I'd rather them run a few bad races than for them to excel in pride and it gets so bad that God has to take bigger steps. But that's just something you have to realize. He's not saying this to people who are not saved. He's saying this to Christians. God is opposed to the proud but gives grace to the humble. He quoted that for a reason. He's saying that's why you need to be humble. If you're a young man and you're not submitting to authority, that means you're proud. If you are not doing what God tells you to do there, well, guess what? Then God's not going to approve of how you're conducting yourself in the church. If as an elder you are abusing your authority, God's not going to be happy with you either. You could preach the best sermon, you could lead millions of people to Christ. But if that goes to your head and you get proud, okay, well, guess what? Pride comes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. So, it's also from Proverbs.
It's like in James when he says you ask and do not receive, and and there he's talking more so about how their motives are wrong, but the idea is that when God is opposed to you, He's not necessarily going to listen to your prayers either.
Yep.
And he actually kind of touched on that earlier too. It was a different emphasis because he quoted a psalm, and it wasn't necessarily emphasized on the proudness. It was more so about seeking peace and doing good.
Yeah.
But in chapter 3, he quotes from the psalm, "The one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and His ears attend to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." And in the context of the letter, he's talking to Christians, and he is encouraging them to not suffer for doing evil. So I think that when he's quoting that, he's not talking about, again, unsaved people. He's talking about Christians and saying that if you are suffering for doing evil, yeah, God may not listen to your prayers. He might be opposed to you. I think it's kind of a similar thing here too. We just have to be mindful of that, because we could read through stuff like this and skip over it and not think, well, that might be a very real reality for us.
I'm trying to see what you say about the younger men in the church having to be able to accept responsibility of being humble, because you can't be humble at a low rank and I can be capable of higher ranking and doing more things. I still see that the self-image is just, pride is just not a good thing.
Yep.
Definitely not.
Then you should. And I see a lot of times in like the Olympics, like when it's so interesting that there's so many Christian athletes that they win first place or they make some great athletic accomplishment, and it's actually like a good thing that they always say that like God helped them do it, because they make great physical accomplishments, and then their achievements they recognize God and they don't like glorify themselves.
You think
I
that,
think that points to higher power.
well, like, again, I didn't really research it too much, but like I heard some reports of like the athletes, when they were getting interviewed, they told them like, don't mention God and this and that, and they still did it anyway. I feel like I don't know how much that happened, but
No idea. We should
Well-
probably start wrapping up a little bit.
yeah,
Yeah, I would say just one last thing, just to kind of tie back into like previous sections, but part of me is kind of like inserting here, but I do think that maybe part of what he has in mind with the giving grace to the humble, like I kind of said earlier, like in all of this, he's been encouraging them to pray, and I do think that a part of that does have to do with how God responds to your prayer. And he's kind of hinted at this before too, like in chapter 3 with the husbands and wives. He says, "You husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered." And the idea to me is that, like, going back to this, is that, like, ultimately that does kind of come from a sense of humility, is that he is commanding the husband to show her honor as a fellow heir, which involves like a sense of equality, like not putting yourself above them, which is pride. And specifically, it's so that your prayers will not be hindered. And then yeah, just think about like in chapter 4, the end of all things that is at hand, therefore be of sound thinking and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. And he goes on, but just throughout all this, just remembering that, I mean, basically just pride really does affect your prayer life, as does, not seeking peace and doing evil things, but also just being proud. Like, there's just so many things that it can lead to, but if you can humble yourself and treat other people as equals, that will actually, God's more likely to listen to what you ask him, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm just connecting the pieces from earlier, where the reason they're so concerned about their reputation is connecting to their morality, and then so the suffering of injustice ties into that they're trying to emulate Jesus, they're trying to copy Jesus, and if like you said, if they're suffering for evil, like if they're doing wrong, that's not going to do any good for the cause. So if they're innocent, if they're doing good and they're suffering, then that shows that their beliefs are valid. And isn't this kind of like an earlier church? Like, this is a small starting off, but they have the principal beliefs of the resurrection.
This probably would have been a letter that would have been circulated throughout a large area, so it's actually more general.
Okay, so churches.
Churches, yeah, it's a big area, like all Turkey.
Okay.
Anything else here before we wrap up?
Should probably wrap up because Ben's about bursting at the seams, ready to get out of here. So.
Gotta get up and go to work.
All right. Well, in that case, does someone want to pray us out?
I guess I'll do it. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us here together to study your word. Help us to clothe ourselves with humility and to throw away our pride, to live as you did, and to even suffer for you, Lord, and knowing that one day we'll be in heaven worshiping you forever. And I just pray, Lord, that you would keep us all safe as we go our separate ways. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Mhm.